سبيل الدموع سبيل مريح تنهدى يا
بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Welcome all of you to the Friday circle. Alhamdulillah, it's a blessing to see so many people here, and it just goes to show how devastated everybody is by what they're seeing on our TV screens and our social media screens. And it also shows a eagerness to find out what the root cause of all of this is, and not be taken in by just the regular bulletin we see coming up on our screens. So inshallah, before we begin, Ibrahim inshallah is going to recite some Quran for us with some translation inshallah.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اذكروا نعمة الله عليكم إذ جاءتكم جنود فأرسلنا عليهم ريحا وجنودا لم تروها وكان الله بما تعملون بصيرا. إذ جاءوكم من فوقكم ومن أسفل منكم وإذ زاغت الأبصار وبلغت القلوب الحناجر وتظنون بالله الظنونا. هنالك ابتلي المؤمنون وزلزلوا زلزالا شديدا. وإذ يقول المنافقون والذين في قلوبهم مرض ما وعدنا الله ورسوله إلا غرورا. وإذ قالت طائفة منهم يا أهل يثرب لا مقام لكم فارجعوا ويستأذن فريق منهم النبي يقولون إن بيوتنا عورة وما هي بعورة إن يريدون إلا فرارا. ولو دخلت عليهم من أقطارها ثم سئلوا الفتنة لآتوها وما تلبثوا بها إلا يسيرا. ولقد كانوا عاهدوا الله من قبل لا يولون الأدبار وكان عهد الله مسؤولا. قل لن ينفعكم الفرار إن فررتم من الموت أو القتل وإذا لا تمتعون إلا قليلا. قل من ذا الذي يعصمكم من الله إن أراد بكم سوءا أو أراد بكم رحمة ولا يجدون لهم من دون الله وليا ولا نصيرا. قد يعلم الله المعوقين منكم والقائلين لإخوانهم هلم إلينا ولا يأتون البأس إلا قليلا. أشحة عليكم فإذا جاء الخوف رأيتهم ينظرون إليك تدور أعينهم كالذي يغشى عليه من الموت فإذا ذهب الخوف سلقوكم بألسنة حداد أشحة على الخير أولئك لم يؤمنوا فأحبط الله أعمالهم وكان ذلك على الله يسيرا. يحسبون الأحزاب لم يذهبوا وإن يأتي الأحزاب يودوا لو أنهم بادون في الأعراب يسألون عن أنبائكم ولو كانوا فيكم ما قاتلوا إلا قليلا. لقد كان لكم في رسول الله أسوة حسنة لمن كان يرجو الله لمن كان يرجو الله واليوم الآخر وذكر الله كثيرا. ولما رأى المؤمنون الأحزاب قالوا هذا ما وعدنا الله ورسوله وصدق الله ورسوله وما زادهم إلا إيمانا وتسليما. من المؤمنين رجال صدقوا ما عاهدوا الله عليه فمنهم من قضى نحبه ومنهم من ينتظر وما بدلوا تبديلا. ليجزي الله الصادقين بصدقهم ويعذب المنافقين إن شاء أو يتوب عليهم إن الله كان غفورا رحيما. ورد الله الذين كفروا بغيظهم لم ينالوا خيرا وكفى الله المؤمنين القتال وكان الله قويا عزيزا. وأنزل الذين ظاهروهم من أهل الكتاب من صياصيهم وقذف في قلوبهم الرعب فريقا تقتلون وتأسرون فريقا وأورثهم أرضهم وديارهم وأموالهم وأرضا لم تطروها وكان الله على كل شيء قديرا.
O you who have believed, remember Allah's blessings upon you when troops advanced towards you, and we sent against them a wind and troops that you could not see, and Allah has always been all-seeing of what you do. When they came upon you, from above you and from beneath you, and when sight swerved and hearts reached their throats, and you assume about Allah various assumptions, and then the believers were tested and were made to quake with a severe earthquake. And the hypocrites and those in whose hearts is sickness say, Allah and His messengers promised us nothing but a deception. Recall too, when a faction of them said, O people of Yathrib, there is no staying for you here, so retreat. And a group of them asked the Prophet to excuse them, saying, indeed our horses are exposed, although they are not exposed, but they want nothing but to flee. And had it been invaded from all sides, and they were asked tribulations, they would have brought it and tarried not but a little. And certainly they had previously covenanted with Allah that they would not turn their backs, and Allah's covenant must be answered for. Say, flight will not benefit you if you flee from death or killing. Even then you will be given no enjoyment but a little. Say, who is it who can safeguard you from Allah if He desires adversity for you or desires mercy for you? Apart from Allah, they can find for themselves neither guardian nor supporter. Allah already knows the hinderers among you, and those who say to their brethren, come along to us, whereas they do not mobilize for battle but a little, begrudging support to you. And when the fair approaches you, see them looking at you, their eyes rolling, like someone fainting at death. Then when panic is over, they scold you with sharp tongues, begrudging you any good. Those who have not believed, so Allah has nullified their deeds, and this matter has always been easy for Allah. They assume that the parties have not gone away, but were the parties to come again, they would wish they were in the deserts with the nomadic Arabs, asking about your news, and if they were among you, they would not fight except a little. Most surely, there has always been an excellent role model for you in the Messenger of Allah, for anyone who has been putting hope in Allah and expecting the last day, and has remembered Allah frequently. And when the believers saw the parties, they said, this is what Allah and His Messenger have promised us, and Allah and His Messenger have told the truth, and it only increased them in faith and submission. Of the believers are men who have been true to what they have promised Allah Azza wa Jalla. So of them is one who fulfilled His promise, and of them is one who still waits, and they have not changed in the least. That Allah may repay the truthful for their truthfulness and punish the hypocrites if He wills, or grant them repentance and accept it from them. Indeed, Allah has always been oft forgiving and bestowing of mercy. And Allah repelled those who denied in their rage. They gained no advantage, and Allah thus spared the believers' combat. And Allah has always been all-powerful and mighty. And he brought down those of the people of the scripture who backed them from their strongholds and threw terror into their hearts, whilst you kill one group and another group you capture. And he made you inherit their homes and their land and their possessions and a land you had never trodden. And Allah has always been powerful over everything.
Jazakallah khair, Ibrahim and Abdullah. At times of this type of devastation, it's really, really important to reflect on our tradition, reflect in our history. And it makes us realize that what we are facing today, it has happened before. It has happened at different times. It's happened to the best of creation and his companions. And these ayat from the Quran about the battle of the trench, when the Muslims were surrounded, it shows the fear that was in the believers at that point, and how when they remembered Allah, they remembered that this is what Allah has promised, and it increased them in two things, in Iman and submission. So, without further ado, I wanted to introduce our speaker today, who's going to give us a detailed history of modern Palestine and the conflict. Some of us get taken in by just the last 5 weeks. Why did this happen? We just follow the news agenda. And it's very important to get a deeper understanding of it. And I'm very privileged to introduce Dr. Azzam Tamimi. I'll just give a short background of who he is. He is a British Palestinian who was born in Hebron. And he acquired his PhD in political philosophy from the University of Westminster in London in 1998. Until 2008, Dr. Tamimi was the director of the London-based Institute of Islamic Political Thought. Until March 2006, he was a visiting professor at Nagoya University, and prior to that, he was a visiting professor at Kyoto University in 2004. Dr. Tamimi has published several books, including Rashid Ghanouchi, Democrat Within Islamism, by Oxford University Press. He also co-edited Islam and Secularism in the Middle East, and his book Hamas, Unwritten Chapters, was published by Hearst London in November 2006. Dr. Tamimi writes and lectures on issues related to Islamic political thought and Middle Eastern politics. He co-founded Al-Hiwar TV channel, which started transmitting via satellite in July 2006, and he presents a number of programs himself, both in Arabic and in English. On a personal level, Dr. Tamimi was the voice that inspired me to get involved in the Palestinian cause many decades ago at university when I was in Chicago. I saw him speaking during the Al-Aqsa Intifada, and his passion, his knowledge, his devotion to the cause really just brought me into the cause. And I'm hoping that, inshallah, many of the youngsters here today, when they hear his words and hear his wisdom, they will equally be taken into the cause fully, inshallah. Bismillah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. Can you hear me? Yes. Now, it goes without saying that Muslims around the world sympathize with the Palestinians. There is no shortage of sympathy. Not only Muslims, freedom-loving people also around the world, justice-loving people around the world also would sympathize with the Palestinians. Of course, as we sympathize with them, we don't sympathize with them because they are Muslim, or because they have the same skin color, or because they belong to the same tribe. That's un-Islamic, because it's very clearly Rasulullah ﷺ told us that in Jahiliyyah, in the dark ages before Islam came, that's the way people supported each other. They supported each other because of certain affiliations. And the Arab saying goes that I side by my brother against my cousin, and with my cousin against the foreigners. No, Islam says no. You have to stand with those who are oppressed, with those who have been denied justice. The hadith of the Prophet ﷺ is very famous. Unsur akhaka zaliman aw mazluman. Support your brother whether he is right or he is wrong. And the Sahaba were astonished. How come, Ya Rasulullah? Okay, we understand that we have to support him if he is wrong with that. But how can we support him if he is wrong? He said, if he is wrong, you stop him. You prevent him from doing injustice to others, from being aggressive to others. The rule in Islam is that وَقَاتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ الَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَكُمْ وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا. fight in the cause of Allah, those who fight you and do not transgress. It's simple, it's very clear. But apart from sympathy, I see a lot of deficiency when it comes to comprehending the background to this problem in Palestine. Not only Muslims who are not Arabs, even Arabs and Palestinians, sometimes they don't grasp the basics. And today, more than at any time before, we need to know those basics. Simply because there is a lot of misinformation, a lot of disinformation, a lot of falsification, a lot of forgery in the media and by people who are usually considered to be respectable in their societies. People like prime ministers, ministers, cabinet ministers, heads of states who blatantly lie. So how do we know what's going on? First of all, we need to know the history of the problem, and then we need to know from authentic sources what's going on the ground. Because ultimately, if I sympathize with someone who is oppressed, I need to defend them. How can I defend them if I don't know the facts? If you are at college or in university, you have mates, you have discussions, you need to provide them with some information to explain to them what's going on. If you are at work, your colleagues, if you have a neighbor, sometimes you are on a bus and you hear people saying, oh, what's going on in this part of the world, Gaza and this and that. You might feel the need to explain things to people. Now, what is this conflict about? Is it between two local communities who suddenly found themselves at odds and just cannot coexist anymore? Is it between Islam and Judaism? Is it between the Muslims and the Jews? Actually, if you read the recent publication by Avi Shleim, the Oxford University professor, he published his memoirs recently, and I interviewed him about his memoirs, and the interview, you can watch it on our YouTube page, Al-Hiwar YouTube page. He is originally an Iraqi Jew. His family of Iraqi Jews, together with thousands of other Iraqi Jews, lived in Iraq.
Downstairs, I can't hear you.
Oh, they cannot hear. Like this? Okay, I'll hold it. Sorry about that. Now, Avi Shleim, who is a son of a Jewish family in Iraq. What's going on?
Diwali.
They should go to Gaza. Avi Shleim explains in his memoirs that his family lived for thousands of years in Iraq with Muslims and Christians, no problem whatsoever. Then suddenly, 4 years after Israel was established in 1948. We're talking here about 1952, 1953. Synagogues in Iraq start being threatened, bombs explode, leaflets are distributed saying, you Jews, if you stay here, we are going to slaughter you, you better go to Israel. He discovered after 50 or 60 years that this was not the action of the Arabs or the Muslims, it was the action of the Mossad. The Israeli intelligence agencies wanted to drive the Jews out of the Arab countries, which were their homes, just like Britain was a home of many Jews, like France was the home of many Jews, Poland, the Ukraine, America, South Africa. There were Jews scattered around the world. When Israel was established, they didn't have enough population. So they were desperate for people to come and live there, because a state without population is no state. And this is what they did with the Jews of Iraq, the Jews of Egypt, the Jews of different parts of that world. Then who are these people that are fighting the Palestinians and claiming to be Jewish? Who are they? The Zionists. I prefer to call them Zionists, because as my dear friend Rabbi Wise and his comrade Rabbi Beck, who are both Orthodox Jews, and we are very close friends, tell me that these Zionists are kuffar. And he tried to explain to me, he said, I ask you a question. If somebody says he is a Muslim because he was born as a Muslim, but he is not convinced that Allah exists, and he doesn't believe that the Quran is the word of God, would you call him a Muslim? I said, no, I wouldn't. He said, exactly. The Zionists don't believe in God. They are liars. They are not true Jews. Where do they come from? What is the origin of this? The origin of this is Europe. Europe had a Jewish problem for many decades, for many centuries actually. They didn't like the Jews for a variety of reasons. They persecuted the Jews. They treated them very badly. They mocked them. Shakespeare and other than Shakespeare, they mocked the Jews. And not only that, they accused the Jews of being responsible for whatever disaster that befell their society. And this is what was published in a document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. A document that had nothing to do with the Jews, that no Jewish person wrote it. It was written by people affiliated with the Christian Orthodox Church in Russia to justify the pogroms they were carrying out against the Jews. Then this same document was resorted to by Hitler to justify the Holocaust. So you see, they hated the Jews because they claimed the Jews killed Jesus Christ, because they were a different religion, because they were a minority, because they wanted to maintain their own identity, their language, their religion, etc., for a variety of reasons. When the Russians started persecuting the Jews in Russia, Russian Jews and Eastern European Jews started migrating toward Western Europe. Do you think Western Europeans welcomed them? They didn't want them. Balfour, Arthur Balfour, the same man who authored the Balfour Declaration in 1917, in 1905 he was the Prime Minister of Britain. He authored a white paper denying the Jews who were fleeing persecution in Eastern Europe and in Russia access to Britain. And he was accused by the British Jews of being anti-Semitic. Actually, the Balfour Declaration itself was accused of being anti-Semitic. It wasn't out of love for the Jews. It was out of a love to use some Jews in a colonial project. Because Zionism, which came and occupied Palestine, was not really a Jewish endeavor. It was a Western colonial endeavor, using a group of Jews who were originally secular and even atheists. And here I would recommend, well, I did not mention to you the title of Avi Shlaim's book. His book's title is 3 Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew. Beautiful book, a great book. I read it in less than a week. The other book I would recommend to you is by John Rose. It's called The Myths of Zionism, and in which he explains that the founding fathers of Zionism and the founding fathers of the State of Israel were all secular atheists. They didn't believe in God, they didn't believe in Moses, they didn't believe in the Torah, but every one of them used the Torah to justify occupying Palestine. And using religion to justify crimes against humanity is not something new. There's another third brilliant book I would recommend to you by Michael Pryor. It's called The Bible and Colonialism. And he explains in his book how throughout the history of Europe, the Bible was used to exterminate other populations, to occupy them, to pillage them, to dispossess them, to rob them of their resources. He cites 3 examples. The example of what the white man of Europe did to the Americas, and you know what they did to what they call the Red Indians. They nearly exterminated them after taking their land. Then he cites the example of South Africa, where a small white minority enslaved the entire black population and ended up dividing society into 3 classes, the whites on top, followed by the Indians, followed by the colored, followed by the blacks. In both cases, they claimed they were acting according to the instructions they received from God. I mean, what sort of God tells you it's okay, you can go and take somebody else's property? What sort of God is this? encouraging theft, encouraging murder. Just blame it on God and go to bed and sleep comfortably. That's what a criminal would do. The third example Michael Pryor cites is the invasion of Palestine by the Zionist movement. Now, initially, these Zionists were a very small minority that most Jews detested. Most Jews. Can you imagine that when Theodor Herzl wanted to convene his first Zionist Congress, he wanted to do it in Zurich, because Zurich was a vibrant city, a big city with a large Jewish community, and he thought he'd be welcome. It was the Jews of Zurich who kicked him out, he and the participants in his conference. So he went and held it in Basel, a much smaller border town with a much smaller or tinier Jewish community. At the time when they met in Basel to talk about their dream of having a homeland for the Jews, a conference was convened by the rabbis, the chief rabbis of Northern America in Montreal at the same time, to condemn the Zionists and declare to the world that they are a curse on the Jewish people, that they are threatening the existence of the Jewish people. But how did this change? It changed because of what happened later on in Europe. First of all, there was the First World War, and the First World War resulted in the defeat of the Ottoman Empire. And the heart of the Ottoman Empire, which is today the Arab countries, fell into the hands of the victors in that war, the French and the British in particular. They divided the area between them and chose or decided to plant in the very heart in Palestine a foreign entity that would make sure colonial interests would continue to be served for a very long time to come. Still, despite the Balfour Declaration and despite the fall of the Ottoman Empire, things remained rather theoretical. Yes, they were under the British mandate, an increasing number of Zionists migrating to Palestine, setting up settlements, but the massive exodus out of Europe of Jews who were only allowed to travel to Palestine. America did not want them, Western Europe didn't want them, they had to go to Palestine, was because of the Holocaust, because of the rise of the Nazis. And here I recommend to you a fourth book, a book by an Israeli historian. His name is Israel Shahat. It's called Jewish Fundamentalism in Israel, and he states in it that until 1939, the leaders of Zionism and the leaders of the Nazis in Europe were meeting and cooperating and coordinating. Why? Because both sides, now imagine here, one of them claimed they were working for the Jews and they wanted to establish a homeland for the Jews. The other hated the Jews and wanted to kill the Jews. Both had one objective they agreed on, and that is to get the Jews out of Europe into Palestine. So developments in Europe encouraged this. At the same time, what was happening to the Arabs? The Arabs as masses were in a very bad shape, many of them far away from their deen, from Islam, ignorance spread, under British and French mandate, local authorities were installed, whose loyalty is not to the masses, but rather to the colonial powers that installed them. And this is how they paved the way for the Nakba in 1948, for the creation of the State of Israel in the land where the Palestinians who were driven out at the time, nearly 1 million of them, more than 2/3 of the population of Palestine at the time, were driven out. So when you look at the people of Gaza today, who are being driven out of North Gaza into the south, who are being massacred every day, children, women, men, the sick, the elderly, these are the people whose parents or grandparents were driven out of their homes in Palestine in 1948. So what actually happened on the 7th of October, for you to appreciate, is that the grandchildren of those who were dispossessed in 1948 returned to their homes, returned to their land. This is what happened. Of course, they knew they couldn't remain there. All they were interested in is to have a few prisoners, to exchange them with the thousands of Palestinian prisoners who are behind bars in Israeli detention centers. So the story did not start on the 7th of October. The story started almost 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. And now when politicians speak, when you listen to the media analysis, television or newspaper article or whatever, it is as if the problem started only on the 7th of October. So the Palestinians would seem to be crazy, would seem to be bloodthirsty. Like I was reading yesterday, a lengthy article published in the New York Times, 3,500 words, almost a third of a master's degree thesis. They actually analyze some of the facts that are going on, but they envelop these facts in packs of lies. All the Palestinians are interested in is destroying Israel. What about their lives that continue to be destroyed by Israel over the past 75 years? There is no mention. The racism with which the issue is approached is typical of colonialism. That's why, in addition to knowing the details of the background to this problem, we need also to learn about similar examples, similar struggles. And you'll find the similarities are striking. Can you imagine that at one time, apartheid South Africa, which was so racist, so heinous, so hateful, was supported by all the liberal democracies in the world? America supported them, Britain supported them. Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan declared that Nelson Mandela was a terrorist. Who would say today that Nelson Mandela is a terrorist? Someone who is mad. Because the man is regarded worldwide, globally, as a hero. He liberated his people from slavery. Yet, during apartheid, they supplied the South African regime with the resources and the ability to continue to persecute the majority of the population. Vietnam. Look at Vietnam. I mean, probably very few of you would know about Vietnam. But I remember when I was maybe the age of these young men here, I used to watch on black and white screens news coming from Vietnam, where the Americans were using napalm to burn entire communities. Entire communities were being wiped out in Vietnam. And yet, on the 7th of October, that very same day, 2 Americans published a very strange analysis. In both of them say that what happened on the 7th of October was very similar to what happened in Vietnam in 1968. What happened in Vietnam in 1968? Something called the Tet Offensive. There was a lunar year celebration. It's a new year, Vietnamese New Year. And usually during these celebrations, it is understood that there is a truce. So the people were celebrating and were enjoying themselves, etc. And the rebels, the Viet Cong, the Thu War, the revolutionaries, launched an attack that they had been preparing for more than a year. They stormed into 2/3 of the cities of South Vietnam. And South Vietnam was armed to the teeth by the Americans, was protected by American troops. Now, what these 2 Americans say is that there are 2 points or 2 aspects of similarities here. First, the surprise element, they took them by surprise and they shook them to the foundations. And second, what came afterwards. What came afterwards was a radical change in the course of history. That was the beginning of the American talk about withdrawing from Vietnam. An end of American hegemony in that part of the world. And they said, both of them, these are not my words, these are their words. They say, we suspect that the 7th of October will mark a change of course in the conflict in this region. And of course, many people in Palestine believe that this is the beginning of the liberation. The Westerners, I'm not talking here about the people. I'm really delighted that a growing number of people in the West see the truth now, and they stand by the truth. And I think recent polls prove this. It's just that we have a problem with politicians who have no conscience, and they have no ethics, and they are hypocritic in claiming to be liberals or democratic. Imagine, they wanted to ban the rally tomorrow, a rally on Armistice Day asking for armistice, and they wanted to ban it. What sort of people think in this way? People who are really undoing the liberal democratic foundations of this country. That's what they're doing. So what these people would say is that these are terrorists. The Palestinians are terrorists who are threatening Israel. What about the Palestinians having been the victims of this occupation for 75 years? What about having remained rotting in refugee camps all this while? What about Gaza remaining 17 years under siege and the Israelis control when they can have water and when they cannot, when they can have electricity and when they cannot, when they can have milk for their children and when they cannot, when they can have medicine and when they cannot? Of course, there's massive destruction of Gaza today, because I think the intention of the Israelis is to turn Gaza into an uninhabitable place and to force or to drive a wedge between the resistance and the people of Gaza. And they haven't succeeded in this second one. Yet, what they are doing to Gaza today, they've been doing in installments for the past 75 years. They've been doing it. The massacres they perpetrated in 1948 in order to frighten the people out. My own mother, who was born in Beersheba, at the age of 16, she, her parents, her siblings, and several other members of the extended family were forced out of their homes in Beersheba. They went to Hebron because they heard the news of what happened in Deir Yassin. Butchery, a massacre like no other. Now, of course, they're repeating it in Gaza, except for one difference. There is a resistance today in Gaza. At that time, the British mandate denied the Palestinians the right to defend themselves. Yet, there were some defenders. My own father joined the resistance that was led by Abdul Qadir al-Husseini, rahimahullah. My own uncle was martyred in one of the battles, defending Al-Quds. But they were a very small group. Nobody armed them, nobody supported them, and the entire world order was against them. Israel managed to take the land, or the Zionists managed to take the land, expel the people, and establish their state. What I want to conclude, because I think it's better not to talk a lot and leave room for interaction and discussion. What I want to conclude from all of this is that there is a story behind what's going on today. It's a long story, but it's a simple story. And this story is not unique. It's similar to previous examples. Let me conclude by one example. Algeria. Any of you has any knowledge of what happened to Algeria for 130 years? For 130 years, Algeria was colonized by the French. Not only colonized, the French annexed Algeria. Algeria became part of France, and the French administration sought to impose on the French people their own culture, their own language, and attempted even to impose on them their own religion. You think the Christian Africans, they were just like that Christian from time memorial? Colonial powers converted them to Christianity, and by force. Whereas when Islam went into Africa, it didn't go with armies, not even into Asia. it was simply business people, trading, people who interacted with them, who dealt with them, loved Islam and became Muslim. And this is the story I was told by our brothers in Indonesia and Malaysia when I visited that country, or that part of the world. In the colonial powers used the Bible one time after the other, as I explained to you, in order to impose their hegemony on other parts of the world. Algeria, to become free in the early 60s, how many millions did you think died in the struggle for freedom? Between 10 and 15 million people. And they were called terrorists. And they were called all sorts of names. Did it bother them? Do you think it bothers our brothers that they are called terrorists? Well, Nelson Mandela was called a terrorist. And we are all Nelson Mandela. Every single one of us is a Nelson Mandela. Legitimately struggling for freedom from occupation and from oppression. So you need to equip yourself with the facts. And there are all sorts of books that are available. Upon the request of the brothers, I brought with me tonight a few of my own book. I have a book called Hamas Unwritten Chapters. It tells the story of Hamas. Because much of what you hear about Hamas in the media is distorted. Hamas actually, originally, before it became Hamas, was a society reformation sort of project. The Muslim Brotherhood. It was the Muslim Brotherhood of Palestine. You know, the Muslim Brotherhood were established initially in Cairo by Hassan al-Banna in 1928. And then in the 40s, they spread out in the region. And the chapter in Palestine was established in 1946. In 1987, it's really a long story, but very briefly, in 1987, when the Palestinians erupted in an uprising, the Intifada, called the Intifada, the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood decided that enough is enough. This occupation cannot be tolerated. It is not enough to just be engaged in education, in tarbiyah, and memorizing the Quran and the Hadith. All of this has to continue, of course, but in addition to that, we have to join our people in resisting the occupation. And they called themselves Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya. So Hamas is the acronym for the Arabic name. In my book, in the first chapter, I explain the history of Palestine. In the second chapter, I explain the birth of Hamas and its evolution. In the third chapter, I talk about its ideology. In the fourth chapter, I talk about the development of its tactics, resistance tactics, etc. So there's several chapters. It is important to educate ourselves about the history of the problem, about other similar projects of liberation, and about the people who are today making the news, so that we are not fed false information about them. I think I better stop here, and I hope that this is, let's call it a prelude.
Quite a lot to get through.
Yeah.
Jazakumullah khair, Dr. Azzam. I've just got a few questions just to start, and then inshallah we can open the floor. And some of these have been given to me by the brothers beforehand, so all my questions. I mean, firstly, you mentioned about the false narrative that's given about Hamas. And in terms of this particular incident, a lot of allegations have been made, stuff like targeting babies, targeting women, rape, these kind of allegations. From obviously you're an expert on the movement, you've studied it, you've met with the people, you've engaged with them. Do these allegations, are they consistent with what you know of the movement?
Well, the only evidence we have really documented is of Israeli women praising Hamas. Even Biden, who claimed to have seen a picture of beheaded babies, retracted under pressure from the White House because it was a lie. It's not true, never happened. See, Hamas are a Muslim movement. They train their members on Islamic values before they train them on resistance tactics. And they are told that in warfare in Islam, you don't ever harm non-combatants. It's haram. You cannot do this. But how are the Israelis going to mobilize the world against Hamas? A pack of lies, lie after lie. And recently, an American researcher proved that much of the killing that happened in the areas that Hamas stormed into was done actually by the Israeli army. The Israeli army didn't want to negotiate a release of prisoners, and they started bombing the houses where the Hamas members were sitting with some of their hostages. They killed everybody. Of course, Hamas people did not die without resistance. There was fierce fighting. So all of this about Hamas being brutal, being terrorist, being this, it's all nonsense. It's all Israeli propaganda, all of it. And I regret to say that our media and some of our intellectuals, if you tell them a story, if you say, for instance, Azzam Tamimi says the following, they will say, oh, well, we are not really sure, we don't know if he's telling the truth. I mean, what is his source? What is this? They start questioning everything that comes from sources they are not sympathetic to. But if something comes from Netanyahu, immediately it is taken without investigation, without even questioning. None of those who claim that they were beheaded babies asked even for the evidence to prove it. So it was all lies. But let me explain something to you that happened on that day. On that day, even Hamas did not expect such a total collapse of the Israeli defenses. Within minutes, there was no defense. The fence was down, the army surrendered or couldn't or fled, and they found themselves roaming freely. And when the people of Gaza heard of this, hundreds, if not thousands of them rushed into those liberated areas. And some of them started just picking anybody and taking them home with them. To the extent that eventually afterwards, Hamas was asking people to hand over to the leadership whatever they have in their houses, because this is not the way to do it. You cannot do this. So there was confusion. There was things got out of hand simply because the Israelis put no resistance. And all this talk about one of the strongest armies in the world and the fortifications they had, all the modern equipment for monitoring and for reconnaissance, all of it became a myth. And Netanyahu had to call on Father Biden to come to his assistance.
Exactly. So, in terms of what the strategy is for Hamas, their short-term strategy with this attack, and then long-term, what is the end game for them? I mean, in the past they've talked about settling on a hudna, or a truce on the 67 borders. Other times they have rejected that. So what is the current thinking of the leadership, if you're aware?
Well, you see, if your home is taken from you, what would be your strategy? Take it back. It's simple, isn't it? Now, if you cannot take it back, you might say, okay, until I am able to take it back, I would probably settle for a little less. But without, this is the important point, without recognizing the legitimacy of the theft. And this is the difference between Hamas and Fatah. Fatah, under the leadership of Yasser Arafat at that time, and today under the leadership of Abu Mazen, decided by themselves, without even consulting my mother or the Palestinian people or the thousands of Palestinian refugees, decided that it's okay, we can recognize Israel's right to exist on 2/3 of Palestine, provided they give us 1/3 to establish a state of our own on it. Of course, that's not acceptable. You cannot do this. Take the example, let's go back again to South Africa. In South Africa, the ANC and the other groups who were resisting apartheid, they were resisting militarily, they were resisting politically, they were resisting diplomatically, they were doing all sorts of work. Then, when there was a global movement against apartheid, and I remember it very well when I was a student here in the 70s, in the 80s, in the mid-80s or in the late 80s, the South African authorities went to Nelson Mandela in his prison. Do you know how many years he spent in prison? 27 years. And they said to him, we want this to end. How can we end it? He said, very simple. Declare apartheid null and void. End apartheid. And everybody becomes equal human beings. Oh, we cannot do this. Oh, you have to do it. He refused to negotiate with them anything until they agreed to this. So in Palestine, of course, there is room for negotiation. We are not against people living with us, irrespective of their religion. And by the way, there is a brilliant piece I would like to recommend to you by Muhammad Asad. You know Muhammad Asad? Leopold Weiss, his pre-Islam name. He was Jewish and then he embraced Islam. Muhammad Asad wrote a piece called Jerusalem, the Open City, in which he explains that throughout the history of the city, it was open only when ruled by Islam, because Islam recognizes the rights of others to worship. Whereas when the Crusaders took it, they closed it to the Muslims and the Jews. When the Zionists occupied it, they are now trying to close it to the Christians and to the Muslims. But nevertheless, suppose the Israelis tomorrow come and say, oh Palestinians, we are very sorry we did this to you, everything was wrong, we shouldn't have done it. How can we live together? Very easy, we say, declare Zionism to be null and void. Just like Nelson Mandela said, declare apartheid null and void. Zionism is an image, is a mirror image of apartheid. It's a racist ideology that claims that Jews are superhumans, that they are superior to everybody else. And if you are Jewish, if you can prove to be Jewish, and you come from anywhere in the world, immediately you become a full citizen, you get a house, you get a salary, you get all the benefits. And the Palestinians are in refugee camps, cannot go back to their homes. So Zionism is the problem. So Hamas actually came into existence because the earlier National Liberation Movement, led by Yasser Arafat, decided to give up on the struggle. Okay, you give up on the struggle, you go to hell, no problem, nobody, who cares? Allah will send somebody else. This is what Allah says in the Quran. وَإِن تَتَوَلَّوْا يَسْتَبْدِلْ قَوْمًا غَيْرَكُمْ ثُمَّ لَا يَكُونُوا أَمْثَالَكُمْ. If you change heart, Allah will replace you by others who will not be like you. Truth is truth. Justice is justice. There are values you cannot compromise on. So yes, there can be room for everybody to live, but to live as equal, dignified human being without a regime that is racist, that is fascist, and that believes in the supremacy of one certain community over all other communities. This is the ideology of Hamas.
And Sheikh, could you clarify, in terms of Gaza, there's a lot of confusion about who is actually in charge, because we obviously Hamas won the elections back in 2006.
2006, yes.
But at the same time, there's been no elections since then, to my knowledge.
No.
And the Palestinian Authority are still the official body? How does it work? How is the structure? Are Hamas part of the Palestinian Authority or a separate entity?
Well, in 2006, George W. Bush, the same guy, the crazy guy who invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, decided to improve his status in the world. His image was so ugly, he wanted to beautify it a bit. So he told the Iraqis, you have to have elections. He told Abbas, you have to have elections. He told the other, you have to have elections. And Abbas said to him, please, please, master, I cannot do elections. If I do elections, Hamas will win. What can we do? He said, no. We have information, Hamas cannot win. You will win. Just do elections. I want people to say I'm encouraging democracy. So they held the elections and Hamas won. Now when Hamas won, They go crazy, crazier and crazier. They decided to come up with 3 conditions. They said, okay, Hamas, you won the elections. Yes, it's true, it's democratic elections, it's fair elections, it's nothing like it ever before. But we cannot deal with you until you comply with these 3 conditions. First, recognize Israel's right to exist, which means become another Fatah. Second, disarm and renounce violence. So no more jihad, no more resistance. Third, you have to accept all the deals, all the agreements signed by the PLO with Israel. And these 3 conditions, which were actually cooked in Tel Aviv by Ehud Olmert, who was the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, were adopted by the Americans, and the Americans forced them on the world, and they became known as the Quartet Conditions. You probably heard the term, or some of you. Of course, Hamas cannot accept any of them. Hamas said to them, go to hell. We won't accept any of them. So they tried something else. In 2007, the Americans sent General Dayton, who, with the collaboration of the Palestinian Authority troops in Gaza, who were actually there to protect Jewish settlers and Jewish troops rather than protect the Palestinians, decided to have a coup d'etat against Hamas, to topple Hamas. They couldn't, they lost, Hamas won, and we ended up with a situation where Israel enabled the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah to control the West Bank and imprison all Hamas people or kill them. In Gaza, Hamas was in charge, and as a result, they put Gaza under siege. It has been under siege since 1917, since 2017. Of course, that siege would never have succeeded. Sorry, since 2007. Since 2007, it's nearly 16, 17 years now. That siege would never have worked had it not been for the collaboration of the Egyptian regime. And that's why when Dr. Muhammad Morsi, rahimahullah, ruled Egypt for 1 year, that siege almost came to an end. Remember in 2012, maybe some of you were young, were old enough to watch the news. In 2012, there was an attack like this on Gaza. And Morsi made a speech and said, we shall not leave Gaza alone. And he forced the Americans to force the Israelis to stop the war in a few days. Today, there is someone ruling Egypt who is a Zionist, another Zionist. There is a Zionist ruling Egypt, a Zionist ruling Saudi Arabia, a Zionist ruling the United Arab Emirates. Most of the Arab leaders are Zionists. And that's why, you see, the problem in Palestine is not between the Muslims and the Jews. It's between the Muslims and the Zionists, because Zionists today are of all colors. There are Jewish Zionists, there are Christian Zionists, and there are Muslim Zionists. I forgot, of course, to mention to you something very important, that Jewish Zionism was preceded by Christian Zionism, which is much older. And I recommend to you the books that talk about the history of Christian Zionism. One of them, those written by the Reverend Sizer. Remember Stephen Sizer? I think they even took him to court recently. Yeah. I don't know what happened. Accused him of anti-Semitism. But he has brilliant writings on the history of Christian Zionism. So this is really what happened.
Okay, inshallah, I'm going to open the floor to any questions. So if you've got a question, just if you could just speak loudly so everyone can hear it, and then the Sheikh can answer. Okay, Hasnain, uncle, and then brother over here.
Assalamu alaikum. I have 2 questions. One is, there's been some videos on social media saying that the reason why the attacks are happening is because of local minerals and resources in Gaza, and that's what, I don't know if there's any truth to that, number 1. And 2, why do the Americans support Israel so unequivocally, like blind faith? I think a lot of people are confused as to why money, weapons, and that kind of stuff, and it's just no questions asked.
So 2 questions. The first question is the rumor that there are minerals in Gaza, and that's why these attacks are taking place. I don't think that's true. There's no evidence whatsoever. And by the way, there are so many rumors and conspiracy theory explanations you need to be really wary of. I mean, some people were as silly as to propagate that Hamas was lured into Israel by the Israelis themselves because they wanted to find an excuse to attack Gaza. That is nonsense. Doesn't make sense. But the second question, why are the Americans so supportive of Israel? Not just the Americans, actually the Western world as a whole, but because America is leading now and has fleets around the world and it has resources, big armies, etc. One reason is that America sees itself in Israel. This is how America was created in the first place. When they went and conquered those lands that they call America today, they claimed to be the Hebrews killing the Canaanites. The Red Indians were the Canaanites, and America was called the land of Canaan. So actually they embodied the biblical stories, applied them to themselves. So it's a form of occupation, settler occupation. But another reason is that it's the American political system, which needs to mobilize the voters, and here lobbies play an important role, and the pro-Israel lobby is one of the biggest lobbies in America. There are other lobbies as well that also support Israel. There is a myth that was created over the time, and it was created by the pro-Israel lobby, that Israel is essential for Western security. And it's nonsense, really. History proves the exact opposite. Israel is a burden on the West. It's a burden on the UK. It's a burden on America. Taxpayers' money go to these invaders of somebody else's country to make them live a life of paradise while persecuting the indigenous population. Before the fall of the Soviet Union, the myth was that Israel was a shield against communism. Then after the fall of the Soviet Union, Israel became a shield against Islamic fundamentalism. So Israel is always having a role to play. Look at the region of the Middle East. Where are the American troops? Where are the American and Western bases? Not in Israel. They are in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, in Qatar, in Jordan, in Djibouti, in various other African countries, various other Asian countries, in Turkey. It's the Arabs and the Muslims who are serving America and the West. Even during the time when oil was very important, much more important than it is today, the oil was with the Arabs, and the Arabs were selling it almost free of charge to the Americans and their allies in the West. So in what way really has Israel been of use to the West? The third reason, and I would recommend strongly here the books of Grace Halsell, an American journalist and a very dear friend. She passed away several years ago, who wrote about the influence of Christian Zionism in America. She said in one of her books, her book is called Forcing the Hand of God, that 60% of those who frequent Protestant churches in America are Zionists. So you see, this is a huge lobby. Actually, Israel receives a lot more support from Christians in America than from Jews. And today, there are more Jews opposed to Israel in America than Christians. So there are a variety of factors involved.
Assalamu alaikum. Our youngsters over here, they must be thinking as to why this matter hasn't been resolved. And so I understand the heart of the problem whenever there's a negotiation being done or there will be settlement, it falls upon United Nations. And as you know, United Nations are a club of 5. And therefore the youngsters do not understand that one vetoes. And every time, no matter what you say, what we want, majority of our Muslim brothers and sisters want our Palestine state and the land to be given back. But the whole of the world will be voting in favor But one veto is caused all the damage. And that is the heart of the problem, how to resolve this veto problem. Because we can talk here all day, all night. We can resist, we can go for the marches. But it ends up in United Nations. And that's where our government, and there was talk about ceasefire. We abstain. As a nation, we abstain for a ceasefire. And when you want to lobby your MP, I went and lobbied an MP, I don't know how many of you did. Our local MP is Dr. Rosina Ali Khan. And she said she speaks passionately about Palestine. But when it came to the House of Commons, when this latest debate was going on, she was not even there to voice the opinion of us. That look, ceasefire is what is needed now. So all this resolution is the heart of what needs to be done for our land, our Palestinian brothers and sisters. But we cannot do that because one of the veto power. How would you resolve this particular problem unless you abolish the club itself of the five? Could you elaborate and also elaborate on the Balfour Declaration? Was it a deception when that was declared and what was meant to do? Jazakallah khair.
Well, see, regarding the question is about the United Nations. I mean, if people who are longing to be free wait for the United Nations to declare them free, the Vietnamese would not have been free, the Algerians would not have been free, the South Africans would not have been free. The United Nations is a useless institution.
Exactly.
It is the institution of those it was created by those who were victors in the Second World War.
Yes.
They designed it in order to maintain their hegemony over the world. The General Assembly can decide whatever it wants. It has no value.
Yeah.
It doesn't count. Any resolution made by the General Assembly doesn't count. And most resolutions are good by the General Assembly, but they are of no value. The Security Council is designed specifically to make sure that these big powers, the big shayateen on earth, the arch satans, are the ones who are always in control. So I assure you that the Palestinians are not waiting for the United Nations. I mean, look at the poor Secretary General of the United Nations. He's been shouting for a month now, please open the housing. Please, the children are dying. Please enable us to get the children out from underneath the rubble. There is a humanitarian crisis. Do something. And then Biden says, "Oh, shut up." Sunak says, "None of your business." The other, what's the United Nations for then? It's just a silly institution. So you don't expect much out of it. When you are victorious, they will celebrate you. They will celebrate you as they celebrated Nelson Mandela. Now, regarding the Balfour Declaration, the reason really the British gave the Balfour Declaration is probably multifaceted. One reason is that they were under the impression that the Zionists were controlling the world. Imagine, the rulers of Britain at the time believed in conspiracy theory. They thought that, and if they are controlling the world, we need them to side with us in the war. And this was like, it's like telling them, okay, we're going to give you this, provided you support us. And of course, Britain in particular was in need of funding its military operations at the time. But also, the rulers of Britain at that time were Christian Zionists. Christian Zionists believe that the Messiah will not come until all the Jews are taken back to Palestine. That's their faith. It's the exact opposite of the doctrine of Jewish orthodoxy regarding the Messiah. Orthodox Jews believe that it is haram for the Jews to go to Palestine until the Messiah comes. So Messiah comes first, then you go to the Promised Land. No, the Christian Zionists say to them, no. You have to go to Palestine for our own Messiah to come. And then when our Messiah comes, he will come and slaughter you. So Christian Zionism is actually the most anti-Semitic idea ever. So it's because they were anti-Semitic. But also, add to this, having seen that the war was going in their direction and that the Ottomans were losing, they wanted to make sure that the Muslims would never be able to stand on their feet again. How do you do this? You come to their heart, you divide it into pieces, you create useless, failing states. There are 22 Arab stupid states. None of them is really a real state. No sovereignty, no independence, no strength, no power, nothing. And then you plant right in the very heart a foreign entity that acts as a military outpost. This is Israel. And look at what's happening. Remember 10 years ago what happened? 10 years ago, 2013, there was a coup against the first democratically elected president in the Arab world. First ever, Muhammad Morsi, rahmatullah alayhi. Now, who plotted that coup and who executed it? Yes, elements within the Egyptian army, but who funded them? And who ordered them? And who coordinated with them? Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel. So Israel is there to prevent any progress, any renaissance, any advancement. They collaborate with the despots who are persecuting the ulama. Today there are no less than 30 to 40,000 alim in Saudi prisons. Can you imagine? And while the people of Gaza are being slaughtered, Mohammed bin Salman is organizing discourse in Riyadh. Did you see the images? Some of you probably did. It's crazy what's happening. That's why I call them Zionist rulers. So the existence of Israel was horrified to see the Arab Spring bring changes to the region, as much as the rulers of despotic states were horrified. So they joined hands together in order to kill democratization. Because democracy in the Arab world, democracy in the Muslim lands will produce freedom, will produce independence, will produce societies that will not be subjugated by foreign powers. And they didn't want that to happen.
Exactly.
Two questions really. So like you mentioned, there are open enemies in the West and there are munafiqeens in Arab world. Who do you see as the biggest threat, i.e. The evangelicals and the APAC lobby, or the Arab Zionists who are, as David Ben Gurion said, they are the first line of defense for Israel? These CCs, the MBZ and MBS and whatever, Jordan King. And the second question is, what do you see the end solution of this, and how do you envision it happening? And also want to add a good source for anyone who wants to understand it. There was a movie last year that came out in Israel. It's called Till Kingdom Come. It explains exactly the relation between evangelicals and the Zionists and how they actually collaborate. Like you just said, they obviously want the Jews to go there, but they believe Jesus will come, and once they don't believe it, we'll kill them. So it's a very good documentary. So that's my two questions.
The first question is about who is more of a threat to the Ummah, the kuffar or the hypocrites. Of course the hypocrites. This is what the Quran tells us. هم العدو فاحذرهم. They are the real enemy. So beware. Because they can fool many people. They fool many people. Many people. I don't know if you've seen some groups that say, "Oh, this is Waliul Amr. He is the ruler. You just obey him, no matter what he does." And one of their so-called ulama appeared on television saying, if the ruler appears on television committing zina for half an hour, you cannot complain. Because he is the ruler. So the ruler becomes another idol, another sanam, another entity that you worship. It's terrible. They created these groups, and these groups, they have their long beards, and they have this sign on their foreheads that they are regularly praying, doing qiyam, and they have short jallabiya. But if you speak a word against Wali al-Amr, oh, that's kufr. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to rise against injustice. If Wali al-Amr, if the ruler is unjust, if the ruler is imprisoning and persecuting people for merely speaking their mind, do you just say, we accept, we obey, and we listen and obey? Rasulullah says in the hadith, سيد الشهداء حمزة ورجل قام إلى سلطان جائر فأمره ونهاه فقتله. The master of martyrs is Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib radiallahu anhu. And a person who stands up to a tyrant, enjoins him to do the good, forbids him from doing the evil, and gets killed for it. Speaking the truth in front of a tyrant is considered to be one of the greatest jihad in the eyes of Allah. How come that some people are claiming that you cannot criticize them, you cannot talk about them? What is this? And actually, by the way, I did research one time, and I found that this idea goes all the way back to Saint Paul. It's not Islamic. Saint Paul, in one of his epistles, in one of his messages, you remember, he used to send messages, you find them toward the end of the Bible, Saint Paul's messages. He'd recommend to them what to do. He said to them, the ruler is the shade of God on earth. If he were to take your wealth and beat your back, you still say, I listen and obey. Actually, they borrowed that and introduced it into Islam. It's alien to Islam. Islam is about freedom. When you say, La ilaha illallah, Muhammadun Rasulullah, then you are a free man. And you cannot say, La ilaha illallah and Muhammad Rasulullah and remain a slave. It's impossible. Because the only power to which you subjugate yourself, to which you bow yourself, is Allah, not any of His creations. So these hypocrites, actually, they fool many people. And we need to enlighten people about them. And don't be intimidated into not criticizing these hypocrites who are destroying the ummah from within. You think, had it not been for the collusion of the Arab rulers today, Gaza would be destroyed the way it's being destroyed? Why don't they open the Rafah crossing? Why don't they allow the sick out and allow food and medicines and water in? Today, in the north of Gaza, not a drop of water is left. No medicines whatsoever. Electricity is off. Why aren't the Egyptians opening the border? Because they are ruled by Zionists. That's the only reason, the explanation I have for it. I forgot the second question.
And the second question is, what's the end game?
Of course, the end game is free Palestine. There's no question about it. Palestine will be free sooner or later. Zionism will come to an end sooner or later. Just like apartheid came to an end, just like the occupation of Vietnam came to an end, just like the occupation of Algeria came to an end. And if we live long enough and see it, we will be celebrating that. Of course, today now, they're trying to intimidate us with all sorts of things. Don't be intimidated. By the way, I have two pieces of advice for you. First, know your rights. Because not everything that is mentioned in the media should frighten us. Okay, they mention my name and say that I am this and that. So what? So what? I haven't done anything wrong. I'm not afraid of the police. I'm not afraid of anybody because I haven't done anything wrong. There is a law in this country and there is rule of law. If you do something wrong, there are courts. And to a certain degree, the judiciary in this country is fair. They try to intimidate us by publishing articles, by saying, if you hoist the Palestinian flag, that's a sign of this and that. If you say Palestine is free from the river to the sea, then that's this and that. Nonsense. Even the police responded to this silly lady, saying to her, it's none of your business. The police doesn't even under the law. The police is not run by the Home Secretary. She actually tried to impose herself onto somebody else's business. and she's been failing, and I hope that we'll see her depart soon. So, my first advice to you is that don't be intimidated. Know your rights, so that you don't unnecessarily withdraw. There's this margin, for instance, for action. Try to push to the limit of the law. Don't violate the law. Violating the law is not good for our cause. Don't do anything that is banned by the law. But there are so many things that are not banned by the law. Why should we impose restrictions on ourselves just because they're saying things here and there?
The second thing?
We had two advices you said.
What was the other one? I remember it.
Okay, brothers, if we're calling you just one question, yeah? Not two, okay, to give another chance. Your brother here, and then in the corner, and then over here.
Hello, Sanatul. You mentioned the creation of Christian Zionism, and before Theodore Herzl's vision, is it true that part of this was in creation with the Schofield Bible, previous to that, in conjunction with Oxford University? And secondly, is it true that Israel was originally meant to be in Uganda, what the original plan was? Thirdly, is it got anything to do with the oil pipeline?
I saw one question or two, you asked three.
Yeah, the oil pipeline, is there anything to do with that as well? That's it. I think that'll come.
Well, the first question is about Christian Zionism. Christian Zionism goes all the way back to Martin Luther and Calvin, the founders of the Protestant sect. They go all the way back to the Reformation. They were the ones who suggested that the role the Jews have in the kingdom of God is to go to the Holy Land to pave the way for the coming of the Messiah. And Christian Zionism was actually quite active for a number of centuries. The ideology itself was used by colonial authorities wherever they went. So it's really quite old. And at the time when, of course, for Theodor Herzl almost converted to Christianity to find a better job. Because this is what young Jewish men usually did in Europe. I mean, you know the story of Karl Marx, don't you? Usually Muslims naively accuse Karl Marx of being Jewish. Actually, he wasn't Jewish. His grandparent was a Jew. His father converted to Christianity, and he was born and grew up to be in contempt of religion. He hated all religions, including Judaism. In Europe in the 19th century onwards, because of the persecution of the Jews, because of the racism and the discrimination, many of them converted to Christianity. Then Theodor Herzl heard the news coming from Russia of the pogroms. And then he decided, no, probably the solution is not to convert to Christianity. They'll never be happy with us no matter what. We need to have a homeland of our own. Theodor Herzl was of the opinion that Argentina was the best place for a Jewish homeland. Far away from the headache. Why stay with the Muslims and have headache? But when he discussed this idea with the delegates in the Zionist Congress, the Russian delegates said to him, it won't work. Because we want to sell the idea to the Jews. The Jews already reject us as Zionists. How can we sell the idea to them? It has to be in the Holy Land, something connected to Judaism. There were several attempts. Uganda, he even went and asked for Libya from the Italian king, because Libya was an Italian colony. He asked the British to give them Cyprus. The British refused. And they got Palestine not because of their efforts. They got Palestine because of the British. The British wanted Palestine to be the Jewish homeland. That's why it happened. Did you ask other questions? I forgot.
Just the oil pipeline one then.
What's that?
The oil pipeline story, is there any truth in that?
Oil pipeline?
Oil.
Oil pipeline. There are all sorts of stories, not on oil pipelines, and there is a train that is supposed to go from Haifa all the way to Abu Dhabi. passing through Riyadh and probably Mecca for the Jews to do Umrah. I don't know. The Saudis, they're changing the deen. Wal'iyadu billah.
Go in the corner.
So you mentioned that there is a lot of empathy for the Palestinians right now. So I would ask for advice. There's a time and place for everything. Inshallah, tomorrow there'll be close to 1 million people marching. What advice would you give to the British youngsters? What they can practically do? What do you want us to do for the Palestinians?
You just reminded me of the second advice I was going to give. Now, the second advice is that you need to look at yourself and see what talent you have. What talent do you have? In what way can I help? If you have a good writing talent, use it. All these pieces published in the media or the programs that are shown on television or heard on radio, if they are not telling the truth, if they are misleading the public, write to the editor, write to the producer, complain. I was in Peterborough 3 weeks ago, I think at the beginning of the crisis. I was in Peterborough giving a talk, and a young Muslim lady came and told me she was working for the BBC at the time, and she said something interesting has changed. In the old days, most complaints to the BBC came from pro-Israel people. Now 50-50. 50% come from pro-Palestine. We want this to become 90% to 10%. Complain more. I mean, complain in truth, not just anything. I mean, you have to have the right information, you know what you're talking about, and give them the correction that you said so and so and so, this is not right, etc. So, secondly, these rallies are very important. Very, very important. I'll tell you what happened in 2009, when we also were demonstrating, and that clip comes from that demonstration. I said something in that demonstration that was legal at the time, now it's no longer legal. But anyway, I received a call from a brother in Gaza, and he said to me, next time you speak in a rally, I want you to convey a message to the crowds. I said, what? He said, tell them when we see them, and when we hear that they are holding these gatherings for us, we know we are not alone in the world. It's very important for their morale, very important. Yeah. It lifts up their morale despite all the pain and the agony and the suffering that they are having. So I would urge you, if you don't have something more important to do, your participations in these rallies are very important, and they bring pressure to bear on the decision makers. See, this is a democracy. There are certain aspects we don't like because there is an aspect of hypocrisy, but still, this is a democratic system. The people who run the affairs of the population are elected. We have to have a role in influencing this process. How do we influence this process if we stay at home? There are council elections, there are parliamentary elections, there are sometimes trade union elections. Any election you are eligible to participate in, be tactical in your choice. Contact the candidates. Ask them about what they think of what's going on in Palestine, or what they think of Palestine. And if you don't like what they're saying, I'm not giving you my vote. Very easy. They love to have your vote. I mean, they live on the votes for 4 or 5 years, and then there will be another cycle. So make use of it. I am opposed to Muslims who say there is no point in participating in the elections. Yes, there is a point. And we should make a difference. In certain localities, the Muslim vote can make a difference. And today the Muslims are not alone. Today we have hundreds of thousands of non-Muslims also who sympathize with the Palestinians and want to see justice in Palestine. So we need to enter into alliances with others as well. This is an issue for humanity. Yes, of course, Palestine matters to us as Muslims, and there are aspects of our faith connected to it, but we share with humanity the aspiration to see justice served in Palestine. So this is my second advice for all of you.
So I understand why the West is clinging on to supporting Israel, and you slightly preempted my next question, is why the Arab leaders do not do more, especially in the in the view of the West influence really diminishing and the focus being shifted from the West to the other parts of the world. And you slightly corrected that by saying that there are Muslim Zionists, and that's a completely novel concept for me. So would you mind saying a few words about the Muslim Zionism?
You see, a Muslim who is defeated from within becomes vulnerable. And it's very easy for others to buy you, or to blackmail you, or to subjugate you. And this is what happens to these rulers. These rulers have self-interests, and all they are concerned about is to remain in power and keep grabbing, keep stealing these wealth and investing it around the world. They don't care about the people. And they see their interests served by entering into an alliance with the enemies of Islam. It's as simple as that. And as such, they become Zionists. The idea of the Arab Spring, what was known as the Arab Spring or the Arab uprisings, was to change this situation and to empower the people to elect their own rulers. I mean, most of Africa today, the people elect their rulers. Many parts of Asia, people elect their rulers. Most of Latin America, people elect their rulers. Except in the Arab world. It's like a haram thing. Haram by who? Haram made by these despots and the powers they ally themselves with. The Israelis were horrified when Muhammad Morsi was elected, and they celebrated when he was deposed. It just tells you the sort of business that takes place between them, the Zionists who occupy Palestine, and the Zionists who occupy palaces around the Arab world.
Abdullah, and then Zubair, and then Sheikh. You could repeat the question for the sisters.
Okay.
I wanted to ask what's the strategy of Fatah at the moment, and is there any work that they do with Hamas, or is there any chance of reconciliation with Hamas in the future for a united front in resistance?
There are elements of Fatah. The question is about what is the strategy of Fatah and are they doing business with Hamas, etc. In Gaza at the moment, I think most of the work is done by Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Now, in the West Bank, there was recently a phenomenon called the Den of the Lions. You probably heard the Den of the Lions, or the Lions Den. Young men who come from different factions, some identify with Hamas, some with Islamic Jihad, some with Fatah, some with others, and who engage the Israelis in hot spots inside the West Bank where the settlers are occupying land or houses, or when there are attempts to demolish houses. I think Fatah as an organization is almost finished. It was really killed by the peace process. They promised the Palestinians a peace process, and there was no peace in the land. Because the Israelis were not serious about giving the Palestinians anything. And this is what Yasser Arafat discovered upon his return from Camp David in 2000. And he decided to ignite the second intifada in September 2000 in the hope of forcing the hand of the Israelis. But the Israelis actually were waiting for, they came after him, they besieged him for several months, and then eventually killed him. But today, Mahmoud Abbas and his authority, who speak in the name of Fatah, are actually collaborating with the Israelis. Without them, the Israelis could not have continued to occupy the West Bank. So Fatah practically is really finished.
Assalamu alaikum. Do you know how well the resistance fighters are doing against the IDF? Are you ready done for?
The only, how well are the resistance fighters doing against the IDF? I personally don't know. The only information we have is what is announced in press conferences. They hold a press conference every day. It's usually, Al Jazeera usually airs that live. They issue statements every now and then. Yesterday, Abu Ubaida, the spokesman for Al-Qassam Brigades, said that they counted 130 tanks and armored vehicles destroyed for Israel. So they say they're doing well. But the problem is that the Israelis are going after the civilians. So I don't have any other information apart from what they themselves announce through the media outlets.
Okay. We have to finish. There's one question that someone sent me which I need to ask, the comments I'll ask. This is the last question, inshallah. Is if you were to address a room full of Israeli citizens, what would your message to them be?
Well, I'd say there can be a future in which we can all live together. A future in which we are all equal, dignified human beings. If you're willing to renounce Zionism, which is the idea of Jewish supremacy, there's no problem at all. We lived with the Jews and the Christians for centuries, and we can do that again. And by the way, when my book was published in 2007, I received calls from different people around the world who told me there were former senior Israeli officials who were interested in discussing with me a chapter in my book about Hudna, long-term truce, because this concept is, although it existed in Islam for a very long time, Hamas developed it in case the Israelis are willing to enter into a long-term truce. And I was invited at one time by a think tank belonging to a European government, and they arranged for me a meeting with 3 former very, very top Israeli officials. And we had discussions over 2 days. And I was very clear to them. The Palestinians, the Arabs and the Muslims would never recognize the legitimacy of Israel. But they would recognize the legitimacy of the Jews. They have to. Because the Jews are the people of the book. They have a covenant from Allah and His Prophet. So if you want to end this conflict, it can be ended in one go, or it can be ended in stages. One go, like South Africa, you renounce Zionism and we start a new situation, and we build a future together. In stages, we have a truce. We agree through negotiations the terms of the truce, in what is known as a de facto recognition, but not a de jure recognition. These are legal terms, you know them of course, that legally it's not a legitimate entity, but you recognize its existence and you are willing to accept its existence for a certain period of time. What is the idea behind this? The idea behind this is that if there is a truce between Hamas and Israel, let's say for 20 years or 30 years, and both sides keep their sides of the bargain, who will be around in 30 years? Most of the people who were alive during the early days of the truce would probably have died or retired. There will be a new generation. So we leave it to the new generation to decide after 30 years how to proceed. They might decide to renew the truce. They might decide to even take it further and say, well, we are living peacefully and without hostilities. Why don't we just change the whole formula? Or they could go back fighting. But at least for 30 years, for 20 years, for 15 years, whatever. For 10 years, it can begin with 5 years as an experiment. And they asked me this question. They said, how do we guarantee that Hamas will keep its word? I said because hudna in Islam is a religious thing. If you enter into hudna, you are bound by your faith to keep it. You cannot be the first to violate it. And this is what happened with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So if we can talk to them. I have no problem talking and explaining to them and even offering a way out of this predicament.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Azzam. I think if we could, we'll stay here till very late in the
Can I
night.
take one last question?
Azzam doesn't have to let it, if you don't mind. One last question.
Could you clarify the currency which is being used in Palestine and the funding which a lot of charities are doing to collect, I understand, is blocked down by Israeli sources, and secondly, the settlement keeps on expanding. So how can you have a settlement when they keep on encouraging the settlement to grow?
First question is about the currency and the donations.
Yes.
Are you asking about the whole of Palestine or just Gaza? Because Gaza today, of course, Gaza under the present situation is closed.
Yes.
Nothing comes in, nothing comes out. But before the 7th of October, donations went through. And the Qataris paid for the salaries of employees. All civil employees, their salaries were paid by the Qataris. And the Israelis allowed that. There was an arrangement to allow this. Now, the settlements are in the West Bank. In Gaza, the settlements that were in Gaza were all vacated in 2005. But now the Israelis are threatening that after retaking Gaza, they might reconstruct settlements again. And the Americans are saying to them, it's not a good idea, we don't advise you to do this. The currency is the dollar or whatever currency. Of course, they use the local Israeli currency at times, the shekel as well.
But is it blocked if you send the money now?
No, now Gaza is under siege. Water doesn't go in, medicines don't go in. But of course, we expect very soon, inshallah, things will improve. Gaza will reopen, and therefore you can donate to charities that are recognized as legitimate charities in this country and who have operations in Gaza, and the money will go. Because people need to rebuild their lives.
On that point, there's a collection downstairs by Human Aid, who we work quite closely with, and they're for the Gaza case, inshallah, if you can donate on the way out. Just the staff mentioned about Know Your Rights. Inshallah, on the 24th of this month, we're having a Know Your Rights, Know Your Duties workshop in this masjid organized by Cage. So put that in your diaries. Friday Circle hosting that on the 24th of November in 2 weeks' time. There's another similar workshop in Tooting Islamic Center on the 19th, on the Sunday night. So just, if you miss one, you can attend the other. They're both being done by Cage. Dr. Azzam has brought some books. I've got 8 reservations. How many people?
I brought 16.
Okay, good. So there's 8 that brothers have told me, and then there'll be 8 more if anybody wants to purchase it from him directly. Jazakallah khair for coming, particularly Dr. Azzam. He's a very busy man, and he's come a very long way just to help us, inshallah. We just have more takbir for him. Takbir! Takbir! Takbir!
سبيل الدموع سبيل مريح تنهدى يا صاحبي